A burning suburban home at night, Daniel clutching Emily and kids while HOA members watch from the distance. Imagine waking up one morning to find a letter taped to your front door, not a friendly note, but a demand. A demand from the very people who were supposed to protect the neighborhood, threatening fines, threats, and something far worse if you didn't obey their rules. At first, it seemed like nothing more than petty harassment. But then, the demands grew darker, the punishments crueler, until one choice set everything on fire, literally. How far would you go to fight back when your own community turns against you? A seemingly perfect community hiding rules, Daniel mowing lawn, Emily with her garden, HOA rep watching with clipboard. At first glance, the neighborhood looked like the kind of place people dream about. Tree-lined streets, neatly trimmed lawns, and the quiet comfort of a community where everyone seemed to know each other. To most, it was picture-perfect suburbia, the kind of place where families felt safe, and where people believed their hard work had finally paid off. For Daniel and his wife, Emily, moving here was a milestone. They had saved for years, working late nights and sacrificing vacations, just to afford this modest home on the corner lot. It wasn't extravagant, but to them, it was everything. Their children could ride bikes without fear of speeding traffic. The backyard was big enough for a swing set, and Emily finally had space for the little garden she had always dreamed of. At first, the community welcomed them warmly. Neighbors waved when they walked the dog, and the couple felt they had finally found their place. The neighborhood gatherings, summer barbecues, holiday decorations, little block parties, gave them a sense of belonging they hadn't experienced before. But beneath the smiles and friendly handshakes, Daniel noticed something else. Rules. Quietly posted on bulletin boards, tucked into the fine print of newsletters, slipped into conversations like harmless reminders. The grass couldn't grow beyond a certain height. Mailboxes had to be painted one specific shade of beige. Holiday decorations were allowed, but only within a strict window of time. Most of the neighbors didn't question it. They followed along, perhaps out of habit or fear of being noticed. But Daniel couldn't help but feel a faint unease. Why were so many small details so carefully controlled? And who, exactly, was enforcing these invisible boundaries? That answer came soon enough. The Homeowners Association, the HOA, wasn't just a background presence. It was a warning about Emily's garden, Daniel holding a violation letter while HOA rep points at flowers. At first, Daniel thought the warning about Emily's garden would blow over. Maybe it was just one board member on a power trip, or some minor misunderstanding. He even told Emily not to worry, insisting that they'd work it out at the next meeting. But that optimism didn't last long. Because soon after that first letter, more began to arrive. At first it was the garden. Then, the board claimed his mailbox was painted the wrong shade of beige. Daniel checked the paint himself, it was the exact color code listed in the HOA handbook. But the letter said otherwise, and with it came a fine. $50 for failure to comply. Daniel didn't pay. He refused on principle. That's when the real harassment began. The HOA fines and notices piling up, Daniel and Emily stressed at the kitchen table. Within weeks, it seemed like every minor detail of his property was suddenly under scrutiny. The grass was too long. The trash bins were left out too early. A child's bicycle leaning against the porch was deemed unsightly. Each violation carried its own warning, and soon the fines piled up like snow in a storm. Daniel knew what this was, retaliation. He had pushed back against the first notice, and now the HOA had marked him as a target. But what stunned him was the pettiness, the precision of their attacks. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table, a stack of letters spread out in front of him. Emily hovered nearby, her face pale with worry. "How can they even get away with this?" she whispered. Daniel didn't have an answer. And that silence, the helplessness of it, burned deeper than the fines themselves. The harassment wasn't just on paper. It began to creep into their daily lives. The dramatic board meeting confrontation, Daniel pointing at the HOA board while Emily and kids watch. The room was filled with board members in pressed polos and smug smiles, seated at a long table like judges in a courtroom. The audience, neighbors he'd once considered friends, sat quietly in the back, their expressions unreadable. Daniel presented his case. He showed his photos, his proof, his reasoning. And every time, the board dismissed him with rehearsed politeness. Your evidence isn't sufficient. Those are just your interpretations of the rules. This isn't up for debate. Finally, one of them leaned forward and said, if you're unhappy here, perhaps this community isn't the right fit for you. It was a thinly veiled threat. Leave, or suffer. The fines escalated. The dramatic board meeting confrontation, Daniel pointing at the HOA board while Emily and kids watch. The room was filled with board members in pressed polos and smug smiles, seated at a long table like judges in a courtroom. The audience, neighbors he'd once considered friends, sat quietly in the back, their expressions unreadable. Daniel presented his case. He showed his photos, his proof, his reasoning. And every time, the board dismissed him with rehearsed politeness. Your evidence isn't sufficient. Those are just your interpretations of the rules. This isn't up for debate. Finally, one of them leaned forward and said, if you're unhappy here, perhaps this community isn't the right fit for you. It was a thinly veiled threat. Leave, or suffer. The fines escalated. Daniel drops the legal bomb, binder slammed on table as board recalls. The HOA had made one critical mistake. In their arrogance, they had left a paper trail. Daniel had copies of their financial statements, obtained through a request at a public meeting. And buried inside those pages were transactions that didn't add up. Tens of thousands of dollars marked for community maintenance had vanished into companies that didn't exist, or worse, into companies owned by board members' relatives. It was fraud. And it was the weapon Daniel needed. When the next HOA meeting rolled around, Daniel showed up early. The HOA crumbles under exposure, neighbors cheer as defeated board members walk away. Gasps filled the room. Neighbors leaned forward in their chairs, eyes wide. Carl's smirk faltered. He shuffled the papers in front of him, but Daniel didn't stop. One by one, the documents laid bare the corruption. And by the time he finished, the room was no longer silent. It was filled with whispers, outrage, and a sudden, undeniable shift. The board was exposed. Daniel didn't just win the fight, he ended their reign. The HOA, once untouchable, began to collapse under the weight of investigations, resignations, and lawsuits. The family rebuilding in peace, Emily's garden restored as kids and neighbors smile. A bright morning replaced the long nights of dread. For the first time in months, Daniel and Emily walked through their neighborhood without fear, their children laughing freely once again. Emily's garden bloomed brighter than ever, each flower a symbol of resilience. Neighbors who once turned away now greeted them with warmth, some even apologizing for their silence. The HOA was gone. The fear was gone. And in its place was something Daniel had almost forgotten, peace. Because in the end, it wasn't just about fines, or rules, or even corruption. It was about standing up to the people who believed power gave them the right to destroy lives. And Daniel proved them wrong.